You can sit there. Hello, welcome back. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back, Carter. Welcome back, Carter. All righty. How was the food? All right. Okay, so before we get started, I'm going to do this little thing that this Japanese friend taught me. You can sit or you can stand. I'm coming around. That just gets your blood. She says it gets your blood going. Okay, so we've had our little exercise for the day. You've had some good food. I hope you've enjoyed your session. Give us some shout out if you've enjoyed some sessions today. Woo-hoo! I was session hopping. Start the afternoon with our keynote, Dr. Amoaba. I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to introduce her. Dr. Gooden is the Vice President for the Division of People, Culture, and Belonging at Kent State University. She has earned her bachelor's and master's degree at Guelph University, then a master's and a PhD, both in African American Studies at Temple University. In the years since, Dr. Gooden has used higher education as a pathway to drive community mobilization and change for racialized and underserved populations. Her love for history pushed her to become a professor and researcher, and her passion for social justice and change drives her to explore and speak out about life experiences of peoples of African descent and other marginalized and underserved populations. Wait, didn't I just say exactly that? I did, right? That's okay, you heard it twice. Dr. Gooden's research and teaching interests focus primarily on migration, identity, barriers to health, and health promotion. Her work have expanded beyond the Canada and the United States to include Jamaica, her country of birth. Woohoo! In that work, Dr. Gooden highlights the narratives and cultural structures of peoples of African descent. She is a catalyst for equitable change for disadvantaged people, and we are honored to host her today. Please welcome our inaugural keynote speaker, Dr. Amoaba.
Thank you. Hello, Memorial University. Can you hear me? I am so excited to be here at the inaugural Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, Anti-Racism Conference. So I'm just going to speak to Heather for a moment. Hi. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to move around. Will that pose a problem? And I'll try and make sure that I'm visible. Can you please just honor Heather, who's just making this accessible for everyone in this space? And of course, my sincere appreciation to Dr. Mullins, a fierce abolitionist. I think you'd all agree that she serves as an abolitionist in our struggle for freedom and the liberation of all people. And I say fierce because that commitment is needed for us to step in and embody change in a real way, even in the face of opposition. So thank you, Sister Dr. Mullins. Shout out to Cherry. Cherry, I heard Dr. Mullins refer to Cherry as the architect for this conference. She has sent me numerous emails and is responsible so that I'm actually standing here today. So Cherry, wherever you are, thank you. And to Steve, our sound engineer, our IT person, thank you for making it possible for people to visit this space virtually. Then, of course, to our invisible laborers, right? We've got our food service staff and our volunteers who are making this possible. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you. As Dr. Mullins shared, my name is Amoaba Gooden. I use the pronouns she and her, and I offer my pronouns because I do stand in solidarity with members of our 2S LGBTQ+ community. And I pause and talk about this for a little bit because this has been a common practice, right, since 2020, more pronoun use, and we've taken it on, and sometimes not questioning it often, but I offer it for me because as a way of explaining how our movement for change actually privileges all and not just one particular group. And I say that because I used to get emails where individuals would refer to me as he, and I'd get really pissed off. Right? So in this way, they no longer do that, and there's no assumptions around one's gender identity. So Dr. Mullins offered a land acknowledgement statement. And I do want us to honor this. Oftentimes, land acknowledgement statements are merely performative, and I actually want us to move beyond that. I heard last year Dr. Michelle Johnson from York University offer a different perspective on land acknowledgement statements because I read land acknowledgement statements oftentimes, but didn't necessarily think in a very nuanced way how my lived experience as an African descendant person stood in relationship and aligned with the struggle for indigenous freedom and indigenous sovereignty. So as a person of African descent, I recognize that the destruction of indigenous people's land stands in relationship to the forced labor of enslaved Africans who were used to work the land in North America and beyond. So I do want to take a moment and honor that. And I'm going to ask you at your table, just because it's really important for me that we think about how we move beyond the performative nature of land acknowledgement statements, to tell somebody sitting beside you how you honor the lived past and current experiences of our indigenous members of our indigenous community. For faculty, it might be curriculum. You might volunteer, you might donate. Just spend a moment and share how you honor the lives of indigenous folks in your community. And for you, those who are joining us virtually, just please drop a note in the chat. Thank you. Thanks very much. And again, land acknowledgement statements are a way of honoring, acknowledging just the tremors of violence that has lived generations and are still impacting our communities today. Dr. Mullins also offered a labor acknowledgement statement earlier, and I'm going to pay particular attention to Newfoundland. Yes, I corrected myself. Where we know in terms of Black labor and Indigenous labor that shipbuilding and salted cod, codfish fishing really build the industry here. And again, I want us to kind of think about what that space looks like and how you are today honoring the labor of Indigenous folks as well as Black folks in the way that you lived your life. And again, this is around violence that are generational, that are embedded in our communities. And think about curriculum. If we're thinking and centering anti-racism and anti-indigeneity, what does your curriculum look like in honoring the labor of those from the past? And again, just spend 30 seconds sharing that at your table. And again, for those in the chat, you can feel free to drop a note in the chat. And thank you. I do really encourage you to deepen your practice of recognizing and honoring and to move beyond just the performance of acknowledging, but think of the very nuanced and concrete ways that you can really honor the past, current, and the possibility of what the future will look like for Indigenous and Black folks. Because if we really are going to think about EDI-AR, anti-racism in a decolonial, anti-racist, anti-Indigenous feminist way, we really have to put it into practice. So today we're going to look a little bit at EDI-AR at Canadian universities using some data from Universities Canada. We're going to spend some time thinking about frameworks and strategizing, building, and sustaining change, really focusing on the what, who, and how of change. And then I'm going to use the Kent State story as a way of talking about how I use a particular framework, bell hooks, from margin to center framework to do some of that work. I do find it necessary, though, as we're talking about doing EDI, anti-racism change, that we really create not a safe space, but a necessary space. And I find this poem really helpful in setting the tone for conversation. So I'm going to read this poem slowly. And think about, as the words land on you, what it means to create a necessary space, what you need to do this difficult work. Together, we will create a necessary space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. The space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our necessary space together, and we will work on it side by side. So I use this poem really to invite groups who need to work together to begin to think about what is needed to build and sustain momentum in doing the praxis, the theory, and the action of EDI-AR work. The praxis requires that we create a necessary space. Sometimes it means calling people in, and sometimes it means calling them out. Because the work is hellish. It's difficult, but it's needed if we're thinking about the liberation of all people. And this work is required at the level of the individual, and that you need to name in your group what you need, what you're asking for, so that this work can be accomplished. So where are we in Canada related to equity, diversity, and inclusion? So I got this actually from, I'm going to try and make sure that I am always on mic. And Steve, I'm not ready to move yet. You'll see. I'll let you know when I'm going to move, okay? I like to walk around a little bit. So where are we in Canada? The following slides are from a 2022 survey conducted by Universities Canada, which is which includes a number of, and in fact, all of the universities in Canada, and the presidents sit on this body. And the mission of Universities Canada is set to advance mission of their member institutions to transform lives, strengthen communities, and find solutions to the most pressing challenges facing our world. And this is a 22 data, and they use a 2019 data as a benchmark. So in 2022, 89% of all universities in Canada have explicit references to EDI in their strategic plan. And this is up from 77% in 2019. 89% have a campus-wide definition of EDI, up from 55% in 2019. And 83% have an EDI action plan in development, which is up from 70% in 2019. You might ask yourself, why the jump in 2022? Let's honor the racial reckoning that we saw, right, in 2020 during COVID that really pushed institutions in a way that they had not been pushed before. So we see the impact of these efforts across the nation. The priorities in that 2022 EDI, and for those of you, I'm not sure if you've seen this or aware of this, but this is what your presidents have signed on to, right, to implement EDI plans and strategies, to review policies and development of policies. And this really shifted, right? In 2019, the first priority was actually to develop plan. And in 2022, it became implement those plans. In 2019, the second priority was to recruit and retain staff and students from underrepresented populations and to create an inclusive campus culture. In 2022, it meant build an inclusive campus culture. And the third priority was hire and recruit diverse senior leaders, faculty, staff, and students. And of course, we see that this actually remained a priority. So I've lost my notes, so I'm just picking them up now. Structural changes, again, looking at the 2019 survey, we see that there's some changes, but we also see, based on the Canada population, where those disparities still exist, right? So in 2019, 49% of women were in leadership, 53% in 2022. And we look at that with the Canadian population, we see that women are basically on par, right? That slight difference is very minute. For individuals with disability, 4.5% of the population, but we see a slight increase in 2022. But look at that number for Canadian population, 22%, right? That's a pretty disparate gap. For racialized individuals, and this did not include Indigenous folks, by the way, we see 8% in 2019, 15%, significant jump here in 2022, but still a gap relative to the Canadian population. And for members of our 2S LGBTQ plus QIA, 8%, 9.5% in the 22 survey. And I think this 4% is an undercounting, by the way, in the Canadian population, just because of the way that we collect data. So we've got to recognize that. And in terms of Indigenous folks, what we see is that there's about 3.3% of university leaders are recognized or identified as Indigenous. And that was a slight increase, up from 2.9% in the 2019 survey. The Universities Canada also conducted a separate survey based on indigenizing campuses and advancing reconciliation. And what we see in 2022 is close to 90% of institutions have a strategic plan for advancing reconciliation or have a plan in development. And about 50% of universities have a public strategy or action plan specifically to respond to the call for action. Nearly 90% of universities with law schools have already or are in the process of updating their curricula to require all law school students to take a course on Indigenous people and the law. And over 80% of universities with social work programs are incorporating the history and impact of residential schools in the curricula. Yet what we know is that we're still failing, right, to retain, incorporate the respect and voices of differences, especially for those who have historically been identified from the decision-making process. Corinne Coyne-Sanchez is really she's actually doing a postdoc right now at University of Ottawa. She's a PhD student at the time of this quote, is doing some really great work on how universities can advance EDI-AR work. And some of the challenges that your presidents have identified, right, that they really want to address is attracting or retaining diverse talent, a lack of resources to support new EDI initiative. I was just talking to a colleague who had to leave. It's really talking about the struggles that higher education are really facing in Canada with regards to budget cuts. The same thing in the US. And this is really, I believe, we're really in a place where there's an anti-intellectual movement where higher ed is not being valued the way that it's been. And there's a fear, right, that higher ed is turning out liberal, radical individuals. And I think you're seeing that in how funding gets prioritized. Your presidents also identified a lack of data on institutional challenges. And this is really key because you need to know what you're responding to. This is the who, the what, and the how. And universities need to have a data close to practice approach for you to actually enact change, but need to, in your way of how you're going to understand how that change is actually being impacted or realized across the campuses. They've identified institutional culture. The hardest thing to change in university organizations or culture, they identified as a priority. And they've also identified institutional systems, policies, and governance structures as a challenge. And these challenges were from 2019 are also the challenges from 2022. So the question is, how are we going to move the needle on all of these things if 4 years later they're still being identified as a challenge? Scarborough Charter, amazing that a number of Canadian colleges and universities signed off on the Scarborough Charter. Are most people familiar with the Scarborough Charter? No. Okay. I'll read a little bit about the charter. I was quite impressed, actually, when this became a reality. And before I read the charter, I do want to acknowledge the Canadian scholars and artists and activists that have been doing this work for years. So it's not new that 2020, with the racial reckoning, that there's somehow a movement, if you will, and everybody realized that change needs to happen. Our own Dolores Mullins had been doing this work for years, along with Dr. Paul Ajay, who's a faculty member here. I'm thinking of Dr. Elaine Brown Spencer, Carl James, Dr. Carl James and Francis Henry, Melinda Smith, who have been talking about advancing anti-racist organizational change for years. And the work that's coming out of the Scarborough Charter is really based on the research that has existed in Canada for years. And so the Scarborough Charter on anti-Black racism and Black inclusion in higher education, principles, action, and accountabilities really provides a way forward. It was a collaborative, inclusive process that included voices from multiple universities and from the community. And they consulted with the Black community, and they signed a commitment to combat anti-racism and foster Black inclusion in higher education. And according to the website, the charter recognizes the realities of anti-Black racism and includes concrete steps to action to ensure institutional and cross-sector accountabilities. And Dr. Mullins can provide you more information on how the charter works. It's a framework and a guideline, if you will, for universities to really begin to think about how they're going to build this change across institutions. So what do we need to think about when we think about change? What do we need, right? The who, what, and how of change. The what. What do you have to think about? Think about your policies, your procedures, your practices. Think about your curriculum. What about your data-driven decision-making? Who leads this effort? Do they have an EDI anti-racism, anti-indigeneity lens? Is it a community that's collecting this data? Who decides on what data is collected? Who analyzes the data? But more importantly, who's responding to the data? What about your organizational structures? Onboarding, how do people get hired? How are they brought into a culture that's longstanding? What about access? How are you defining access? Is it around socioeconomic status? Is it around ability? What should be included in how you think about access? How are resources allocated? What do you think about student success and graduation? Everybody should know their student success and graduation rates. You should know who's coming in and who's leaving between that 4 to 6 year number. And the data indicates that our most vulnerable population are Indigenous or Black, people of color are not graduating at the same rate in Canada as white Canadians. You need to know your numbers for your institution. What about your curriculum and pedagogy? Not just what you teach in the classroom, what is your approach to teaching like? What does recruitment and retention look like? Who's doing the programming? Who's coming to the programming? What are the professional development opportunities for everybody in your university or in your unit? And who's responsible for addressing climate and culture? Is it one person or is it everybody's responsibility? What about the who? Who are we talking about? Oftentimes when you think about EDI-AR work, we think about the one individual in your unit and university doing this work. But all members of our communities are responsible for doing the work. And we want to think about the work as protecting and securing the rights of the most vulnerable people in your population. Those are not being promoted, those that are not graduating on time, those who are taking on increasing student loans. Indigenous, people of African descent, South Asian communities, or Palestinian Muslims or Christians. How are we thinking about all of them in relation to EDI-AR work? There is a movement right across Canadian universities, North American, in fact, international, around the war in the Middle East. How are your students, your Jewish and Muslim, Palestinian, Arab students being protected? How have they been impacted? Have their assignments been reassigned? Are they giving time to do their assignments because their lives might be impacted by the war? And what about the white folks in the room? What are their responsibility and how do we think about them in this work? And that tends to be the elephant in the room. When we think about EDI-AR work, right, there's a tension about talking about white responsibility, white accountability, white allyship. But we need co-conspirators, we need allies in this work. And we're all privileged in a way, so we have to be able to really think about how our privileges afford us opportunity to advance some of this work. Our Board of Regents, how are they decided, right? What are their responsibilities to EDI-AR work? Are they trained? Do they have the capacity to do this work? But more importantly, do they value this work and see it as everybody's responsibility? And the how, right? The resources, what frameworks you're using, who can move from policy to equity practices? So not just the theory, but who can take the theory and move to action? Are we assessing our own inequities? And I'll give you an example. I served in my position as a vice president for 4 years at Kent State University. I started as a vice president of diversity, equity, inclusion. I now actually just finished aligning two divisions, Division of Human Resources and Division of DEI now report to my portfolio. But as a new DEI vice president, and I'm going to talk about a social movement that we were able to craft collectively at Kent State, I had great town halls. First town hall had hundreds, I think over 500 people. I didn't expect as many people to come, so my Zoom limit was only 500. Big mistake, right? But I didn't have an ASL interpreter. So for individuals who were hard of hearing or needed an interpreter, they couldn't participate. That's my blind spot. And everybody on my team's blind spot. And so I take full responsibility for that, but I use that as assessing your own inequities and biases or privileges or blind spots, the things that we don't see. And a really great example of why we need to collaborate and have multiple voices at the table. The how also includes the praxis, the theory, and the action of doing this work, pushing in, calling back, countering barriers. And we also need a plan. So we can't just talk about it, we need to have concrete plans, and I'm going to go over some of that in a little bit. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about tools for framing and advancing organizational change. And I've been thinking about this tool for a while, and it's actually a tool that I've used to create myself and my team change at Kent State University. So there are really three major components of an organization. You have the people, you have organizational culture, and then you have strategies and structures. So really the question of all EDI-AR leaders is, where do you start? If the tools of advancing change are the people, so the human resources, organizational culture, and strategies and structures, where do you start? So do you start with strategies and structures, right? So this is where I always, in the past, used to start. We've got to change the systems. We've got to change the strategies, right? But the question is, do you have the right people to do that? Or do we start with organizational culture? So organizational culture is a long-term process. It lives in the collective hearts and habits of people and their shared perception of, and we all hear this, how things are done around here, right? That's organizational culture. When you hear, well, that's not how we do things. Well, that's different. They don't understand the culture. And for organization, culture is the most challenging part of the transformation. Change and innovation requires new behaviors from everyone, from all people in an organization, leaders, faculty, staff, students, and even the volunteers. But culture requires a social movement. So for culture to change, you need a social movement. And therefore, for organization to transform, it needs to start with its people. Does that make sense? So people, the faculty and staff in a unit, are really the trajectory of any EDI-AR movement. And at Kent State, I was really able to conceptualize how I wanted to lead, but I did that with a really strong team of both directly reporting to me, but also collaborators from across the university. I also want to say that for those who are leading change, one of the things that we need to really be mindful of is that we're helping to craft the vision. We're not dictating the vision. So it means that as a leader, what we do is show up and we help flesh out a vision. We might give it language, we might give it vision, but for change to happen, it needs to come from the people. They need to be a part of the process. And it's not just middle management or upper management. I'm talking about our first-year students, our graduate students, our ground staff, right, our lecturers. Everybody needs to be a part of the process. And in that way, you're really building the capacity, so their knowledge, but also their practice, their ability to do the work. But we also need to attend to how systems of ideologies, so supremacy and dominance, shows up. And we need to attend to this first at the level of the individual. And we all know we've internalized systems of oppression. I talked about biases a couple minutes ago. We're all implicated in this. It impacts our interpersonal relationship. So how we actually are in relation to other people. It impacts our decision-making at the individual level, but also at the institutional level. And here I want to think about institution as, say, Memorial University as institutions, right? But it also impacts the structure. We see structurally, and here I want to think about systems of structure, so the educational system across Canada, But institution, I want you to really begin to think about your own organization. Oftentimes, we conflate structural and institutional oppression, right? So, for example, the graduation rate at Hmong might be very different from Guelph, right? But across Canada, that graduation rate is similar for our Indigenous and Black folks. So tending and understanding these systems of ideology is really necessary and need to really be centered in any EDI-AR work. You cannot do work related to equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-indigeneity, anti-racism without actually working at that individual level, taking care of your stuff, so to speak, right? I could use another word, but I won't. Okay. Understanding those systems of ideology ensures that you can actually use an equity cycle, an equity lens, if you will, to attend to the work. It impacts everything about how you do the work. If you've got that lens, the decisions you make are different. They're inclusive. It impacts the movement itself, who's included, how you implement it. It impacts the feedback and the outcomes, and it impacts the decision, the stance, if you will, of the organization. So you have to use an equity lens to be able to do the work. I'm going to spend some time talking about Bell Hooks' framework. And, you know, I've been a student of Bell Hooks since I was an undergraduate student at the University of Guelph. Read her book, loved it, but didn't really think about how this framework could be utilized in doing EDI-AR work until about 4 years ago. And I really started to think about my own leadership and not only the legacy that I wanted to leave, I wanted to ensure that when I was not in the room, the work was going to continue. Because oftentimes EDI-AR leaders, it could be about charisma, right? A person that's well liked, who's built strong relationship. So with others, what happens when they're not in the room? And if the work is not continuing, my argument is that the work hasn't even begun, right? So the work has to be sustained even when that leader's not in the room. So Hooks's margin to center framework provides a blueprint for advancing systemic organizational change. It challenges us to think about and really suggests a counter-hegemonic form of resistance because it discursively unpacks the history of exclusion and discrimination in organizations, and also the lasting change of that exclusion. And I really want to note, as I talk about framework, that change is contextual. And that's really important, but we shouldn't confuse contextual change with using context as an excuse not to do the work. All right, so change is contextual, but we can't use it as an excuse for not doing the work. So let's consider how this framework highlights how we can build, embed, and sustain EDI-AR work. And a few things to keep in mind. When we think about the margins, right, where those X's are, we think about you to think about your organization. Who lives on the margins of your organization? So we oftentimes think of the margins of people that are most vulnerable, that are marginalized in any way, shape, or form. What do they look like? Who are they? Where do they work? What are their staffing or faculty levels? And I want to disrupt that a little bit because that is real. But I also want you to think about the brilliance that lies at the margins, the ideas that come out of the margins. Oftentimes we think of the margins as a fixed space. But I'm going to invite you to think about the margins as also a place that one clings to. It's where I find my sustenance. It's where I find my folks that think like me. It's where I find those that are resisting change and fighting for liberation. And is it a space that one wants to lose? That's a question I'm actually still pondering and thinking about. And sometimes it's a space that one does not want to lose, as I said before, because it's a site of resistance and can be a central location. And some of us, based on our identities and our formal positions in organizations, only exist at the margins. So if somebody identifies a member of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, they're also Black and women, I say they lived at the margins of your organization, right? And if they were a lower level staff person, right? So clerk who's underpaid, undervalued, I would say that they lived at the margins of your organization. And then who lives at the center of the spaces that you work? The center has more power, it has more influence, and it is a very active exclusion that can define the center. The center is based on identity, but it's also based on positionality. So identity, I'm here thinking about, Christian, straight, right? English speaking, could be gender. Who lives at the center of that your organization? And sometimes those at the center are at the center for unearned privileges, social class, gender, race, faith. And you'll notice that on the infographic, the AB, and I really want you to pay attention to the AB, right? So those are the individuals that have been cast out, they've been cut off. They can't move because we didn't like how they voiced a criticism or a comment. We don't like how they show up. And these are the individuals that can't move. Can you think of anybody in your organization who's been annexed out, for example? And ask yourself why. But the reality also is that many of us, including myself, live at both the center and the margins. So based on my identity, I would say I'm at the margin, but based on my position of power at the university, I have the benefit of being in the center, being at the decision-making table, and I can also go to the margins. The work for those of us at the center is actually to go to the margins and to partner at the margins, where that brilliance lies, where people based on their lived experience who are experts of their own experience, but also experts of change where they live, where they work. So the role of all of us as leaders is to move to the margins to partner. I'm going to pause there for a moment and just offer, because sometimes it's really, there's a lot going through people's minds when I offer this. And I just want to see if there are any comments or questions that people wanted to raise. At the back, yes, and I think we're going to get you a mic.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Schwartz. I'm from the Department of Political Science at MUN. And my question is about your last comment about people who are both in the margins and at the center, and how do we deal with that? My first thought is when people from the margins are sort of brought in to the center for things like EDI-AR work, how does that, but are they really at the center or are they not really at the center? And how do you personally, but also recommending for us to deal with the ways in which leadership, as you say, like can't just be one person, right? Like, so how do you as a leader cope with the fact or address the fact that you are at the margins even when you're at the center, but also not in the margins and in the center? Anyways, that.
Yeah, thank you. And it was Elizabeth. Pleasure to meet you, Elizabeth. So the goal really of those in the center is not to bring people from the margins to the center, but to actually move to the center. So oftentimes we think about that work as bringing somebody in, right? But if they're the only person at the table, can you really affect change? Their voice is isolated. And if you as a leader move to the margins, you're partnering not just with one individual, but with all of those other individuals, right, at the margins. And that's really what's difficult, because here you're thinking about one person. It can't be one person that's going to represent, right, members of the Black community or the South Asian community, right? It has to be more than one voice that's being represented. right? So the goal is for the leaders to move to the margins, to partner, and not with one individual, but with multiple individuals. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the process, because you're right, oftentimes what we do is we only bring one person in. Does that help?
It helps a little bit. I guess I was more specifically thinking about when the center, not your example of how do we, once we're in the center, do this kind of work, but when the people who are already in the center purport to be doing this work by bringing in someone as the vice president, equity, diversity, inclusion.
I see. All right, thank you. Yeah, this is where your allies, co-conspirators, and multiple voices actually come into play, right? And we see that's oftentimes how organizations work. We can all name organizations who've brought one person in, not provided any resources for them to do the work, and use them as an example of EDI-AR work. This is where the voices of the community is really, really important. And if we really are going to stand in a space of being an abolitionist and a co-conspirator, there needs to be multiple voice calling out that decision. And so questions we're going to need to ask our campuses or organizations is, what are the resources that this person has? What does their team look like? And sometimes for those of us who don't have a formal voice of power to call that out, this is where I always say a social movement is needed, right? So social movement meaning not just one person is responsible, but you're actually organizing collectively around that decision. Other questions or comments? Yeah, there's one at the back. Cherry, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Amnesty Rose. I'm the Sexual Harassment Advisor at Memorial. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of building trust with folks on the margins and what it looks like to honor the commitment to trust, recognizing that institutional violence does sort of permeate, especially if you're someone at the center working to get to the margins in a meaningful way that really follows through on that commitment.
Yeah. So this is where that's contextual. So I would always say we have a practice in my unit of building what we call community agreements. And so that whenever we're forming a group, and this is relatively new within the last 2 years, we actually start with community agreements. And the community agreements requires, now this is about, again, creating that necessary space. It requires that individuals participate and agree on how they're going to be in relationship with each other. And we do this because we want to build a space of trust, right? So I would say the first thing to do in building trust is to start with the voice of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. They are the experts of their own experience. They're going to tell you what they need. And one of the frameworks I use is community agreements to do that. And so community agreements might be, right, everybody has a responsibility of calling people out and calling them in. It's not, can't be the work of one individual. And that might be a part of the agreement. Okay. Thank you. So how do we do this? How do we use like Bell Hook's framework to really enact change? And so I also want to say change can only be created if the experience of the people on the margins, the most vulnerable, so who suffer racist, sexist, homophobic, right, transphobic, and other forms of group oppression are understood, addressed, and incorporated. So if we think about those systems of ideology we have, we can't get to this phase as much as we would like to without addressing those things and have a plan to hold each other accountable when those things are not realized. Again, this is about creating the necessary space and creating a space of trust. So you want to assess the situation. So what's the issue? What's the problem? As a leader, you might have an idea of what the problem is, but again, you can't actually, you can give a vision. You really need to really assemble a group of individuals to do this. So assembling your group. If you're using Bell Hook's framework, who is on the margins that need to be a part of this community? Who's excluded? And as you invite people to the table, you want to ensure that they're also inviting others to the table. So assembling the group, assessing the situation, assembling your group. And then you want to listen to the community, listen to the group, but also listen to the community. And you're also learning from the community. And this is where we have to attend to our own biases and our own equities, because that group is going to actually share their experiences around racism, for example, or inequities with you. And you want to have a data plan, that data close to practice plan. How are you going to measure success? Well, first of all, what are you measuring and how are you going to measure success? And what will your plan, how will you plan around using that data? And then you're going to create your plan, again, with everybody having a part of the decision-making process. And then you want to implement your plan. The implementation part should not be a surprise to any member of your community. If you've gotten to the plan and the implementation and people are surprised, you actually haven't done your due diligence. Because that listening phase and learning phase is where that social movement occurs. It's where you listen to the voice, you're assembling your group, you're creating some momentum, you're building capacity. And it's at that group where you're actually creating that step 4, that plan. One of the things we do is in creating a plan, because sometimes it's hard to get everybody at the table, is we actually offer stipends to faculty in the summer, or for students in particular, we might actually give them a position as consultant, ask them to serve as consultant. It looks really great on their resume, but it also doesn't really restrict them to sometimes our meeting times. I know at higher ed, we can have meetings from morning until night, which doesn't do our students justice. Perhaps you can use focus groups, and I know Dr. Mullins has used this here in creating some of her efforts. Other things to think about as you're constructing a framework for change, right? Who's going to have their needs met and who's not going to have their needs met? If you've identified groups that their needs are not being met, you've got to go back to that listen, learn, measure. Who may receive unintended advantages and privileges? Are there groups that face extra barriers and hurdles in your community that you really need to attend to? And what groups might have unintended or negative impact based on some of the decisions or the plan that you're making? So how did we do this at Kent State? So I really want to honor, and I think I'm going to walk around now, thanks. I really want to honor the power of collaboration. The work that I do at Kent State is actually not done solely by me. It was done with a team of dynamic individuals. We started with 6. But I also assembled a team of faculty, staff, and students to actually deliver the programs and to create initiatives. So it's no longer my initiative, it became the university's initiative. I also had to attend to the possibilities and the contradictions. I talked about systems of ideology before. The reality is not everybody was at the space that they could be anti-racist. They were not the place where they fully understood the value of EDI. So we had to provide some training, but I also had to recognize that as a tension and created those, for example, community agreements about how we're going to work. So Kent State, we're a president's cabinet of 14. I sit on the president's cabinet. In terms of the makeup of that leadership team, we have 10 individuals who identify as white, 4 that identify as Black. We have about 33,000 students. We have an 8-campus system in Northeast Ohio, including a College of Podiatric Medicine. We also have sites in France and Brazil, in Italy, and New York. There are a couple of strategic initiatives that I used and that we used, the team, Bell Hooks' framework to really put together. And I talked a little bit about 2020 and the racial reckoning, and I really utilized that movement or that time as a way to create a social movement. And so as a division, we created a virtual 2-year program calling Strategizing for Change, Shaping a Better Future. It was really important that this became a social movement because that was the only way we were going to be able to have people buy into other initiatives. So the first town hall I shared, we had 500. In a year, we had over 4,000 people attended. How did we do this? One is we used faculty staff to actually deliver the program. Expertise lived on our campus, right? So we used them to deliver the program. But more importantly, we used a chat feature in the chat box, and we invited people to share their ideas of how we could actually shape a better future around race and anti-racism for the community. We then provided and listed those resources on our website, but then we implemented a lot of those suggestions so people could actually see that their suggestions became a lived reality on campus. Because of this, what I call social movement, there's other initiatives that we're able to initiate. I'm going to jump down to the fourth one, Anti-Racism Task Force. 200 people served on that task force from all over our campuses. We had 108 recommendations. We accepted all of those recommendations, one, because they came from the community, and two, we wanted to ensure that we are never going to get to that space where we are racist-free, if you will. So it's really, really important that we accepted those recommendations because we wanted to say some of this is, right, a barrier that we would not be able to remove, or we're thinking about Derek Bell, the permanence of racism. And I'm gonna go ahead and talk a little bit about some of our other initiatives, but also step back a little bit. The work that we do at Kent State didn't start when I arrived in 2020. There's some dynamic faculty and staff that were doing some of this work. Really thinking about student success, we created a student first program where we actually identified the equity gaps in graduation. Look at 2016. There's a 20% graduation gap for Latine or Indigenous and or Black folks. That's pretty significant. So using a data close to practice approach, we shared this, and this is really the work of Dr. Ebony Pringle, shared this with her department chairs, with her deans, and created a plan of action. Plan of action included co-curricular activities, right? Academic advising, looking at their credit load, right? There were classes that we call those DFWs, those high dropout rates, identified those classes and then worked with the faculty member, and in fact, sometimes changed the faculty member teaching those classes, because if their students were failing in those foundational classes, they couldn't advance. So work had to be done there to increase the graduation rate at Kent State University. We also worked on belonging and really created other work such as creating a program for exploratory students in terms of their decision making and where they wanted to go. This is an image of our virtual town hall. At the first town hall, it was really important that the president of the university show up. He showed up at the very first town hall and then watched the others also. And this is really setting a leadership model for his expectation for the other leaders. Anti-Racism Task Force, I said we had over 200 people participate in this. We also created a dashboard, because if we're thinking about accountability, being transparent is one way of holding institutions accountable. So we actually update this regularly where people can actually track our progress towards becoming an anti-racist university. We have a list of members, and I really put this up here because initially we listed all members of our anti-racism task force, the 200 members. We're also at a place in Ohio where it's very anti-DEI, right? So issues around safety, and did people really want to be associated publicly with the work when it might cost them? And so we made the decision actually to remove the names of individuals serving on the task force to protect them. All our recommendations are listed. You can track on the website our recommendations relative to our progress towards goal. Again, another way of holding us accountable. After the Anti-Racism Task Force, we also created, again using Bell Hooks framework, a university-wide DEI strategic plan. And with the president again announcing that his expectation that everybody was expected to participate, we had all 68 units on campus participate in creating a strategic plan and creating a 4-year goal oriented plan. And some of those addressed recruitment, some of it addressed retention, creating an inclusive campus climate in their unit. And we actually also created a metric, again visible, of how each unit is progressing towards their goal. Again, this holds them accountable. They have to submit their goals on a yearly basis to members of the division. And as you can see, they receive a score based on areas of growth. And above, you can see what the focus are, which is really recruitment, selection and hiring, retention, belonging, promotion, professional development, and enhancing DEI expertise. Again, we can see our metrics for what the academic goals are. You can see each unit's progress towards those goals. Some of this is internal facing, so only units inside, because sometimes we know competition happens, right? So some of the data is internal focusing, some of it's external focusing. I'm happy to share that last week, Kent State won Sea Change Institutional Bronze Award. And this is some of that work, the resources, the how, the what. This work itself took about 2 years to do, where we actually audited and assessed every single policy, procedure, and practice on our campus. We looked at our discrimination policy, but we use an anti-racist EDI lens. So it's just not merely about having the policy, it's how the policy actually advances change in the campus. And we're scored based on how we assessed ourselves. So one of the things we had to ask ourselves, was it merely great that we had an anti-discrimination policy? Or are we collecting and are you collecting data around discrimination on your campus? Are there particular units or areas where there are issues, and how you're attending to the information that you're actually gathering? The work we have now to do with Sea Change is that we're going to be measured on how we're going to advance some of the recommendations that we're making towards realizing change. And some of those recommendations include increasing graduation rates, but also includes looking at our tenure and promotion processes in our department. For those of you who are faculty, sometimes there are confusing handbooks in terms of what the standards are for being promoted or getting to full or being tenured, right? So we're making some clarity around some of that and assessing that. And then just in the interest of time, I'm looking at Dr. D. We have, I just have some recommendations and things for you to think about as you think about sustaining and building a strategic relationship in hostile environment. These are some of the recommendations as leaders, right? So you really want to frame your objectives in terms of organizational goals. For EDI-AR, I invite you to look at the Scarborough Charter and then to also look at the 2022 Universities Canada recommendations. Beware of your image. And I put this out there, not asking people to change, right? I do think people need to show up authentically as themselves, but my gift is knowing how people perceive me, because that perception is really never reality, is it, right? And so, for example, I'm perceived on my campus as nice until people get to know me, right? But this actually helps me because I know what that perception is, right? And it helps me because although I might be kind, that I need to be clear about the language that I'm using, how I'm relating to people, right? That I'm not sending mixed messages of niceness. At Kent State, our mantra is be kind, or kindness and respect. So I always try to be kind. But this actually helps me in actually being very clear about what my expectations are. Because I know how people perceive me, sometimes I need to follow up our conversation with an email. So just to be clear, this is what I'm saying. Be fiscally responsible with your budget and your resources. Carve out a niche for yourself and for your staff. Where's that gap that you can actually shine and realize change in your area? Study, learn, and know all that you can about AR, anti-racism, EDI. Know your gaps and your weaknesses and create a plan to address those. Be in community with people who are different from yourself. Be visible, but also invisible. And what I mean by that is, I think as EDI leaders, we have a responsibility of showing up as leaders, setting clear expectations. But there are times when we've got to make sure that other voices are shining in the space. So you are not seen as the only leader, the only person who could do this work in your space. Of course, develop powerful co-conspirators and allies. And I have avoid drama. This is really important in terms of how political the space can be, that you're very clear about how you want to show up in that space, what drama you want to attend to, and those that you want to avoid. And my final thoughts, and this is really around change, it's really important. I had to learn this, is sometimes incremental change is the way to get to transformational change. So the things that are simple, easy to do, like following a recipe, right? So what was really simple and easy to do, it's you're recreating something that worked before, it has low risk, you can do it yourself. You know what the change will be. And I call the simple changes are kind of performative. Like for example, in the US, we have MLK Day, Martin Luther King Day. That's really simple. It's performative. It's easy to do. Everybody buys into it, right? And so sometimes those are really needed to kind of build a social movement. But sometimes it's easy. Be satisfied, be happy with what you think is incremental change. But you really want to begin to move to that transformational stage. And the next step might be a little bit more complicated. It's difficult to do. It might be risky, but you're building your community. You're collaborating. You're being a voice. You have the right team to do it because you're using Bell Hook's framework. This is what we call reformist change, right? You're reframing, reorganizing, you're subtracting, adding, right? Really, it's a bit difficult. You need more involvement in it, but it's quite easy to do. But really, these are steps to get to what we call the transformational change. That organizational culture shift I talked about, the things that are long-standing. So people are no longer saying, it's the way we've always done things. It's the way things have always happened. It's always worked. It's complex. The Tamarack Institute says like raising a child. But what you're doing is influencing outcome. You're very clear about what success looks like. Using your data, you have a framework, and you have a plan of action created by a community that's going to tell you what the next steps are to identifying your success. I'm going to use an example at Kent State. 2016, we had a climate study, also called a environmental and well-being study or engagement and well-being study. And I would say we had thousands of pages of data. What Kent State did was we created what we call the Great Place Initiative that had hundreds of people on the committee that used that data to create an action plan. And from that action plan, we invested $2 million in mental health. We've created a care center for those who are food insecure. We have a staff council advisory body that the president meets with regularly. We've also created a telecommuting policy and a remote work policy that actually came from the climate study. Again, getting in touch with the community, putting a team together, knowing you're going to respond to the data, and then responding to the data. This is really what we call transformational change because it has really transformed the university in a way. Then finally, I want to talk a little bit about leadership, the president's involvement in this transformational leadership, and those who may not have leadership. Sometimes you have to be satisfied with leadership in your area. That context of leadership is really important. You might want to get to this transformational change, but based on your context, maybe you have to start at incremental change, and maybe it's only in your unit that you could see this change. What I encourage you to do is to collaborate with others so that you can then get to the complicated and complex change. And really think about how we are hiring individuals to lead our teams. Do you have leaders that understand EDI-AR and that they can actually invest in this transformational changes using those resources that we talked about earlier? And finally, I'm leaving you with a quote from Bell Hooks. Moving from silence into speech is for the oppressed, the colonized, the exploited, and those who stand and struggle side by side. A gesture of defiance that heals, making life and new growth possible. This is what I'm going to leave you with from Bell Hooks. I invite you to move from that space of silence into speech, perhaps starting at your unit, but really moving from that incremental stage to that, what I hope is a transformational stage for your organization. Thank you. I think we have time for a couple questions, if there are any.
We have one here.
Yes, hi again, myself Najafizoda from the Faculty of Medicine. You presented a slide on the proportions. So I wanted to ask your thoughts on level of marginalization and vulnerability, intersection of vulnerability versus proportional, the notion of proportionality. Just a scenario out of like a community A has 10% of its population with all these marginalization factors. But then it has got one low SOS, poverty rate is at 20%. And if you look at poverty, extreme poverty, 20%, it's going to affect the majority population who do not have all these marginalization or the deserving factor. So what are your thoughts on, because you also showed in one that last LGBTQ, the proportionality wasn't really playing it's a reverse proportionality kind of idea there. So what are your thoughts on this notion of proportionality, like the numbers and frequency?
Not sure what you're asking. Are you talking about identity and marginality related to change?
So here is another example maybe. We have got white male adults in this community who are the majority, 90% of the population. And if you take into account low ACS, and 20% of the population are low ACS, they're going to make 10 million people, while only 5 million people have the other indigenization factor. So what do you do? Resources are limited always in the real world.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think it goes back to the question we talked about earlier about context, right? So EDI-AR work, right, benefits everybody. We know that when we talk about diversity, having compositional diversity at the table is relatively important. Within your context, I'm going to use our example at Kent State for regional campuses, where the majority of the regional campuses are predominantly white Americans who are poor, right? So when we think about access and service and access to institutions, our focus there is on socioeconomic status. Does that mean that they don't have to learn about Indigenous reality or the Black reality? No. But it does mean in taking care of their needs at that campus, that's what we're doing. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
My question is, if you have opportunity of time traveling back, and you have opportunity of going back to talk to yourself about starting this road that you are in, what would be the advice that you would give to your old self?
That's a great question. Yeah. So, I read Harriet Tubman, Most of Her People, when I was about 9 or 10 years old. And I was actually in the basement of my parents' home in Toronto. And I remember standing up and I said, I want to be just like her. That's how I want to be in the world. I really want to shift barriers and I want to fight for the liberation of all people. At the same time, my parents loved reggae music, right? So Peter Tosh is my cousin. It's a true story, right? And there's a song, Black Man, Stand Up for Your Rights. And I don't know, but something hit me in that song. I remember also standing up in my parents' basement. I was sitting on a yellow couch that they used to have. And for me, And there's another story I'm going to share because all three of them aligned. And then when I, as a student at University of Guelph, I had a friend. I didn't know that he identified as gay. He got married and then he disappeared from my life for a while. And I was serving as the human rights coordinator at the undergraduate level. They had a human rights coordinator position. I was the first human rights coordinator. And he came to me after a while, because I hadn't seen him for a while, and he said he had actually checked himself into a mental health institution. And I remember feeling helpless because I didn't know what to do, nor did we have the resources on campus to help him. And so for me, I'm going to go back to Harriet Tubman. I realized that for me, being an abolitionist was, yes, about the liberation of African people, but it was also important for me that I fight for the liberation of all people. And so if I were to tell my younger self what to do, I would say lean into learning a little bit more. But I wouldn't, because I wouldn't be here where I am without those life experiences. So thank you for the question. Thank you, Dolores.
You see that thing did anybody see me do like that? Do you know what that is? When you're in church and you're moving around, put your hand up to tell God you're not going to want to disturb. It's funny how things just come out, huh? Even when you don't expect it. Did you do that in church? Thank you so much, Dr. Gooden. That was stupendous, amazing, inspirational. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And my email is agooden@kent.edu. I always tell Dolores that I stand in service to others doing this work. So if you ever have questions or comments or need assistance, please feel free to reach out. I'll make myself available. Take good care and enjoy the rest of your conference.
So I don't know about you, but I'm on a little bit of fire. And you probably think you're always on fire. So what does that really look like now? But, Dr. Gooden has left us with a lot of gifts, a lot of things to think about. I don't want to tell you what to think, but I know that wherever, you're situated, community, university, government, she's left us with lots for us to think about and lots of things that we can actually do, low-hanging fruits. She talked a lot about doing certain things that I was thinking, money, where do we get that from? But I'll keep that in my back pocket for now. But thank you all so much for attending this keynote session, both online and in person. I hope, you're taking something away that you can use after this. And we are going to hold you here without break or snacks as the schedule. Just joking. We'll see you back here for the next session at 2:00. Thank you.